Hi, people, and welcome to the third episode of the OSINT Hellhole podcast. My name is Jeff, and today I'm joined by a good friend of mine, Savoy.
Hello, how's it going?
Today we again have a decent amount of topics to talk about. For example, Denmark joining the CAVS program, Germany looking into loitering munitions, Belgium jumping to 2% defense spending out of nowhere, a new MLRS being proposed to France, an update on the 2S22 and its production, and then France's single largest defense sale of all time. So let us start off with the CAVS program. Denmark is the latest country to join the program, now consisting out of Finland, Sweden, Latvia, and Germany, outside of Denmark. About 758 units have been sold, with a potential for that to go up to 1,888. Denmark itself is procuring the CAVS to replace its aging fleet of other 6x6 armored personnel carriers and the ever-faithful NATO Cube, the M113. Overall, the CAVS is shaping up to be the light 6x6 ABC that Europe is going to standardize on, just with the sheer number of countries that have already adopted it. The largest adopter will probably be Germany, whom is going to be acquiring it to replace its Fuchs ABC, for which it needs roughly 1,000 units. Then we have Germany looking into loitering munitions. This was going to happen sooner or later, or do you still have something to add on the CAVS?
Oh, just to add on the CAVS, sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, Patria knows what it's doing in terms of marketing a very modular, it basically, if there's such a thing as a commercial off-the-shelf wheeled armored vehicle, Patria seems to have figured that out. I mean, it's Germany. That was one of the particularly surprising aspects that was chosen to replace Fuchs. But I think in general, that's it.
Well,
the cabs will fit the bill for the wheeled armored vehicle.
For Germany, we are pretty sure they have chosen the CAVS over Fuchs 2 or Fuchs Evo or whatever Rheinmetall calls it this month.
Yeah. And assuming lawsuits don't happen that results in them buying both, it probably will. It will fit that role very well. Yeah. And I think for a lot of other European countries who are, in need of a wheeled armored vehicle, cabs is an excellent option. It's probably almost a more successful and more successful in the sense of more things can be done with it, more variants and stuff than the Pandur or that sort of wheeled APC.
Yeah, its main competitors would be the Pandur, it would be the Piranha 6x6, which honestly already strays into the medium APC class.
Yeah.
And then the super thing Iveco was making, I can't remember the name of.
Yeah,
the Super AV, that was it.
Yeah, which was that the vehicle that the U.S. Marine Corps procured, or was that something else?
That's a different one.
Okay.
That's the 8x8 variant. You also have a 6x6 model, I think, of that family.
Yeah. No, like you said, those are both kind of straying into the medium IFV type or medium wheeled, vehicle thing. And I mean, for things like armored ambulances or armored
command vehicles, mortar carriers.
Mortar carrier, although mortar carriers, that is an American, still kind of the Nemo turret still kind of freaks me out a little bit. But I mean, just as the general armored vehicle, where your option is either going to be keeping a legacy vehicle in service forever or an MRAP, I think cabs is going to fill that niche very, very well for a lot of countries. And I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't more interest for it, particularly since Patria seems to be pretty open about the idea of commercial production and even some localized production.
Yeah, the best example for that would be Latvia, whom got a
Yep.
production license despite its, I think, sub 200 vehicle order.
Yeah.
So if that's possible, then it's it's a very appealing vehicle for a country to procure, even if they are only procuring it in the 1 to 200 unit range, because they
Yeah.
can still get a sort of local production out of it if they negotiate right.
Yeah.
Germany, for its case, would do local production of the vehicle with FFG in Flensburg.
Yeah. Yes, I mean it's definitely shaping up to be a very successful program. And like I said, I would not be surprised if there weren't more if there wasn't going to be more interest in acquiring it. Basically as the lower cost light not light, the lower cost armored vehicle that, is in roles that's not an APC. I think
The
there's still a lot of untapped demand for that.
it can fill more roles than the MREP, but it's not a Boxer or an AMV
Yeah.
or a Pandur or a Pandur 2 or what was the other vehicle I'm thinking of? A
Well, the
Piranha.
Piranha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking
And
Striker. I couldn't remember what it was based on.
yeah. Well, that's its own kind of humorous thing too with the Pandur and the Piranha, because those both basically being General Dynamics products with the Spanish production of Pandur, I believe. So unless I'm completely wrong with that.
Pandur is still produced in Czechia. It's the Piranha 5 that is adapted and produced in Spain as
Gotcha.
the Dragon.
Okay. Okay.
At
But
which
yeah, I mean
we
that's
also just got photos of its 30mm equipped variant from the Defense Expo that's going on in Spain right now, and
okay.
it's close to 4 meters tall.
Oh goodness.
It's a tall boy.
Yeah, and you think Boxer is a tall vehicle, and yeah, that's
Yeah,
quite bad.
it is.
And yeah,
The height in and of itself is easy to explain once you actually look at things like mine protection, off-road mobility, obstacle
yeah,
climbing. You need that space between the vehicle and the ground, and you need the space to put your V-shaped hull.
yeah.
So that already takes up 1.5 meters.
Yeah, and once you're adding a turret to it, it becomes an even taller vehicle.
Especially if you're going for
Um,
man turret.
yeah. With calves, has there been any interest in autocannon equipped remote weapon stations for it? I forget who it was that was buying. They bought the Protector remote weapon stations, but has there been any
That was Sweden.
interest in? Okay, but has
Um,
anyone looked in? Yeah.
there have been some offers. I think there's even been a mock-up of it with the Cockerel CPWS Gen 2 turret with either a 25 or a short 30.
Okay.
But I'm not currently aware of anyone procuring it with an autocannon in the turret.
That would not surprise me. I think that would probably be more of if they were looking to export it beyond Europe. I think that would be more the thing that customers would be interested in. But
If you're exporting beyond Europe, yes. If your desired client base is within Europe, then there's not really a need for it on a vehicle
no,
of this type, specifically because of the roles it is meant to fulfill.
yeah, it's being looked at as more of to replace specialized vehicles and such.
It's
With
it's going to be your Fuchs and your NATO box replacement.
yeah, with the Nemo mortar variants, was Germany so far the only confirmed customer for those?
I think Germany is so far the only confirmed customer.
Okay.
Don't quote me on that. I know other countries are already using the Nemo system on different platforms, but I'm pretty sure Germany is so far the only one to have put it on CAVS.
Presumably to replace M113 based
Yeah,
mortar carriers.
those are Blitzing the Panzer mortars.
Yeah, which is something that needed to be replaced for a long time, depending on who you ask. Within the American context, the mortar carrier is not that weird, but for everyone else, that's kind of it. When you can have a turreted mortar, that's probably a much better
I know
option for a
at
lot of
this
things.
point, it is the mortar carrier is really the last M113 variant Germany actually has in proper service.
Okay.
So for
Did they
them,
ever
it
have any
really
of
is
the?
just the legacy vehicle that we somehow need to keep running.
Yeah. Did Germany ever have any M113s in like the medical evacuation vehicle or the command variant?
They had M577s.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure if they had the medical variant or not, or if they made their own medical variant. I'll have to check the Tankograd books for that one, so I can't say for sure.
Okay.
Because, Tankograd did a 4-book series on M113s in German service.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Then I think it's time to move on to Germany and loitering munitions.
Yes, and there was some controversy in some circles about the companies picked for this contract, but I think it was kind of misunderstanding what it was. This really seemed to be the contract the Germans replaced, or the solicitation rather, the Germans replacing for loitering munitions was more for testing and evaluation. If I'm correct, it was a fairly small number.
Yeah, so they have written out 2 small once they finally have a session of the budget committee, will write out 2 small contracts to 2 of Germany's drone producers for a small batch of both of their loitering munitions for testing and evaluation. That should be completed before the end of the year, by which point a full series contract is awarded to the winner of those trials.
Yeah.
The 2 companies chosen are Helsing and Stark. Not a lot of people are going to know Stark, but Stark is basically a semi-subsidiary daughter company to Quantum Systems.
Yes. And I know there was a fair bit what controversy there was about the 2 companies picked was really that the various offerings have not performed all that well in Ukraine.
So the drone that has not performed well in Ukraine is Helsing's HF1 bayonet.
Yes.
Which is a slightly modified variant of the terminal automation AQ100 bayonet, which is an absolute piece of garbage.
Yes.
That's a really bad drone. Ukraine has tested it in the past. They didn't like it. They still don't like it, and we have seen some footage of it where either 1 or 2 were used against a 2S19, failing to destroy it, after which they had to send an FPV to actually kill the thing.
Yeah, and I seem to recall some of the criticism about the predecessor drone. It extended to just its flight performance was just not good.
Its flight performance is not great. Its airframe is relatively weak and prone to breaking apart on violent maneuvering, and its warhead was deemed as insufficient.
Yeah.
Now, that's not the drone that Germany is going to be testing. The Helsing drone that Germany is going to test is the HX2, which is a 100% Helsing product.
Now, was that the quad rotor Lancet looking munition?
Yeah.
Or, okay, the vertical takeoff and landing quad rotor Lancet thing.
The vertical takeoff and landing one is the one from Stark. That's the OWEV.
Okay.
They both have an X-shaped wing design, but on the
Yeah.
Helsing one, the rotors are at the back, while on the Stark one, the rotors are on the wings.
Okay. Well, I guess broadly about Germany and loitering munitions, and this does sort of apply to loitering munitions as a whole, and the countries that are taking a lot of interest in them. I mean, if they are buying them for evaluation, the main thing that is really needed is evaluation. More the development of tactics and doctrine as to how these things are actually supposed to be employed. Because I think we're still sort of at this awkward point in Western militaries where we see other countries are seen using loitering munitions, and there's some debate whether these are, actually in that role or if these are, prop powered cruise missiles or something of that nature versus, we're still at the question of what is a loitering munition? How is this supposed to be employed?
Yeah,
How do
on
we
the note of
structure
them
units?
being mini cruise missiles, both the loitering munitions that Germany is procuring for testing boast a 100-kilometer flight range.
Yeah, and that really creates a lot of complexity as to how are these things going to be deployed. How is that going to affect unit
How is their kill
organization?
chain going to work?
Exactly.
How do you select targets for these? How do you task teams to destroy them? That's
Exactly.
all things we still have to figure out. And even
Yeah.
though Ukraine is using an absurd amount of loitering munitions, especially FPV drones, every single unit of theirs has their own doctrine for it because there is no
Yeah.
standardization between units.
Yeah. So
This
I
is
mean,
how you get these wildly varying performing drone units between someone like let's say Lazar's group, which was completely unheard of before Ukraine started disclosing drone team performance,
yeah.
and someone like Third Assault, the drone unit of Third Assault Brigade, where we basically saw a 2x performance jump going from Third Assault to Lazar group.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, just for major NATO countries like Germany, they need munitions just to play around with to figure out basically to figure out doctrine, to figure out organization. And then also, once that has been done, it helps in terms of figuring out counters to enemy ones. Just giving units actual exposure to how these things are going to be employed.
I
So
know
and
this is something we are currently seeing in the US military, for example, where they are starting to experiment with FPV drones during training exercises.
Yeah, and I believe it was Norway that did some trials. I think they were referred to as the tennis ball trials, where they were doing basically they were dropping tennis balls on tanks, basically
Yeah.
to try to simulate drone dropped munitions. So I mean, anything like that is good, but I'm with loitering munitions. We're still seeing, trade show examples where they're putting them on tanks and things, and it's still a very,
You know,
it's still very,
I don't think that what we should be calling a loitering munition is really something to be fired from a tank. At that point, I
no,
think we're more looking at something like an NLOS ATGM classification.
yeah. And I mean, there's the question there whether even an NLOS ATGM should be mounted to a tank, or whether that should be treated as its own direct fire, or whether that should be treated as an indirect fire system.
Yeah.
Um, I think really with loitering munitions as a whole, the U.S. with the future combat systems, the net fire system or the NLOS missiles program they had in the early 2000s. I think that was probably the earliest glimmer of kind of what how loitering munitions should be employed and what the organization of them should be, where they're treated almost as a artillery type system. They're being, the loitering ones are almost serving as recon assets for the line of sight missiles and would basically be used to finish off targets after bomb damage assessment. But that program was canceled, I believe, in 2009 or something, and it's the entire concept has kind of gone stagnant. So I think a lot of the lessons learned from that and a lot of the organizational ideas from that really just need to be explored again. So I understand some of the concern about the companies that were picked doing it for the German contract, but I mean they are German companies. They do have a product.
They are German companies, and I would say that quantum systems in and of itself should not be considered a weird pick just by the sheer amount of drones they've already delivered. Especially seeing the vector reconnaissance drones, which have even been delivered to US Special Forces.
Yes, and by all accounts, the vectors are very, very good drones. I mean, the commentary out of Ukraine about those was supposedly all quite good as well. So they are a known company.
It's mainly Helsing that poses a bit of concern, seeing the performance of the HF1.
Yeah.
But we still don't know anything about the HX2, specifically because it is a complete from the ground up design from Helsing itself rather than adapting an existing drone. Which even then there's only so much they could do to the AQ100.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, it will be interesting to see just what transpires with those, and if they actually do serious trials with them to try to do doctrinal development and things of that nature, or whether the German loitering munitions trials are just sort of, we need a loitering munition to fill this requirement, and not much is done with it, which would be a pity if that was the case. But
that we will have to see what they do with that once they do these initial trials. And then actually procure a system in volume to do further testing, analysis, doctrine building, training.
Yeah. Which that is part of a wider issue I think the Germans are having also with just buying low level or platoon or company level UAVs as well. There's still, an effort to try to find an acceptable system to employ. That's not a Mavic.
Yeah. They want something that's a bit more robust than a Mavic. Also a bit more military grade, because this is something people often misunderstand about military grade.
Yes.
Military grade systems are not made to be the best on the planet.
No.
They are made to sit in storage for 20 years and still function.
That was a point that I had brought up, when there's the criticism of, I believe it was it Northrop that was showing off a
Northrop showing off a quadcopter loitering munition for the Marine Corps.
Yeah, the quadcopter loitering munition, and it was like $65,000 for this for what is essentially an FPV. And what I said about it is, again, this is something that has to survive potentially 10, 15 years of storage and work when it's taken immediately out of storage. It's something that has to be able to get rained on.
It has to survive seawater conditions, because it's going to be performing with the Marine Corps, like at sea, on islands in littoral spaces.
Yes, but then also, just on top of all of this, you have to be able to build the munition fusing according to basically Department of Defense standards for safe fusing. You have to have
it's not coat hangers.
No, you can't do any of that. And all of these things adds a great deal of cost to the system. So I mean, it's
the FPVs we're seeing in Ukraine, and the reason why they can be produced so cheaply is because they're produced one day and used the other day. They don't sit in storage. They are practically unshielded from the environment. Everything's open and exposed. The batteries are questionable from time to time. Like, I've seen a lot of use of recycled batteries from crashed Teslas.
Yeah. But I have also heard, just with how the Ukrainians view Mavics in general, they are viewed as a consumable.
Now,
They're
all
not.
drones are essentially consumables to a certain
Yeah,
degree,
yeah,
because the reason why you're sending a drone to do a certain task instead of a person is because you are okay with losing the drone.
exactly.
And
But yeah,
also, so
yeah,
to
go ahead.
just to close this out so we can move on the next topic.
Yeah,
So next topic, and this came as a complete surprise to me, and this is Belgium actually going to meet the 2% NATO recommended defense spending for 2025.
which
So,
is quite surprising. Yes,
yeah, which means that we are increasing the military budget by 3.9 billion euros this year to just over 10 billion in total.
which is quite the jump.
By 2029, with expected GDP growth, this is set to grow to almost like just under or over 12 billion euros in total.
Yeah,
Which means that over the next 4 years, we are investing an additional 21.3 billion euros into defense.
which is really staggering. Even considering the relatively small size of Belgium, yes, that is really a
We
staggering
have the
level of
population
investment.
of New York City for
Yeah,
to context this for Americans.
yeah. Now, with this budgetary increase with Belgium, has there been any disclosure as to how much of the funding is going towards things like facility upgrades, or is it
A
is it
lot of it is going to infrastructure works, but there are also a number of procurement programs to fill capability gaps we still have from the peace
yeah,
dividend after the Cold War.
yeah,
So one of the infrastructure things that is being done with the new budget increase is reactivating the railhead at the Leopoldsburg military base.
and that is
A railhead that has not been used since the end of the Cold War, because the last time it
yeah,
was used, it was to offload trains coming from Germany.
yeah,
So
and that is not something
reactivating
that will be
that
cheap.
is going to be a massive increase to military mobility, especially across the continent. Just
Yes,
because we don't have to travel from base to a commercial railhead anymore, we have a railhead at base.
yeah, yeah. That will be hugely significant.
Other things are just general upgrades to base infrastructure because a lot of it has been sort of derelict again since the end of the Cold War when budget pretty much dried up and buildings just fell into disrepair. We also
Yeah, even
have
during
a
yeah,
shortage of actual good storage buildings. For example, we are currently renting storage space for non-military equipment from commercial companies.
yeah. And I
So
mean, I've made the wisecrack that a lot of the Cold War military facilities probably were not in real good shape even during the Cold War. So I mean, just with the increases in European defense spending, yeah, a significant amount of it's going to need to just go towards facilities improvements.
especially for the
Um,
coming 2 to 3 years at least, just to get
yes,
everything into a proper state.
yeah,
Now, there are also other procurement programs currently being executed. We have Serval AD, for example. Last year, we ordered additional Caesars and Mepak mortar carriers.
yeah,
Um, we are eyeing to procure a third frigate,
yeah,
which would be a massive boost to the Navy because that would be the first time ever where the Navy would be able to deploy year round.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
We are eyeing to procure at least an additional 14 F-35s. We have just today signed a letter of intent with Poland for Pure and Manpads.
which there was some controversy about that, wasn't there, as to what the nature of that acquisition was.
So On the
Whether it
topic
was
of on the topic of manpads,
yeah,
the defense brief for 2025 makes a clear distinction between a man-portable manpad, where they gave the example as Stinger, and
yes,
something mounted to a crew station or onto a vehicle like Mistral 1 and 3,
yes,
stating that there is a need for both systems, where the Mistral would be more point defense and used as a shore-at missile because it has an up to 8-kilometer range, while the what at the time was considered to be either Stinger or Purin would be given out to the actual infantry units. Something you really can't do with Mistral because you need to have the
no.
stand.
Now there is also perhaps an argument to be made that this is also a convenient justification to continue buying Mistral and not deviate too far from French doctrine in terms of how things are being employed, given Belgium's relationship with the French.
Overall, last year's announced procurement of Mistral 3 was the first time we would have actual manpads since I think 2018. Because at that point our last Mistral 1's expired.
Okay.
One thing to note, as of sometime mid last year, we have actually begun working with MBDA to refurbish Mistral 1's.
Okay.
And those have already re-entered
question.
service.
Good. With Payorun, and that was me butchering the pronunciation of that.
But yeah, Poland is going to get you for that one.
They will, among other things. But I seem to recall there was some speculation that might have been a low, basically a low quantity purchase for evaluation, or is it
200 to 300 units?
Okay.
Which, so in terms of our army, which is 4 infantry battalions.
Yeah, that's not insignificant.
That's pretty much enough to equip the entire force and have some spare.
Yeah. And these are sure to be for issuance, not as contracted aid for Ukraine or anything.
No, that would have been mentioned at this point if they were, but from everything we have seen from both the announcement and the wording used from both sides, these are meant for the Belgian military.
All right.
On top of that, there could be a potential that those would be partially at least assembled within Belgium, as Mesco, the producer of the Purin, has opened the office here like late last year.
Okay.
So at that point, the missiles could have already been under consideration.
Yeah.
But it's today that they actually signed the letter of intent to actually procure them, which now has to go to Parliament. Parliament has to approve, clear the budget, and then we can sign the contract.
Yeah. But yeah, with either partial assembly or whether that is also, whether the Mesco would also do some servicing of the missiles, in country also, routine maintenance and such. That is quite interesting.
No, them actually setting up a sort of semi-permanent facility where they would do, for example, maintenance on the weapons fits into recent announcements that a part of the Leopoldsburg military base is being converted into a military industrial space where companies could set up their facilities to service the systems on base.
Gotcha.
But that's far more wider reaching than just the pure manpads. That would be pretty much everything we use having the option of being maintained on base instead of having to be returned to the company.
Yeah, which is massive to have that capability. So,
with that, I think we can now move on to our favorite artillery system of all time.
Yes.
The 2S-22.
Yes, which has really had storied and and
Eh,
varied and very unexpected
yeah.
rise in production, and yeah.
No, the latest update we got is that the overall 2S22 family, I'm not 100% sure if this is all SPGs or if this also includes the Toad variant, sorry, has reached at least 36 systems a month, which is
Which
an
is,
absolute
yeah,
staggering amount if you think that prior to the war, they only had a single prototype which they were still evaluating.
it really is. And the thing to me that has really been one of the more interesting revelations out of that has been that seemingly the Ukrainians do have barrel production for them.
You know,
You know,
barrel
there
production
was
for the 2S22 is being done with tooling adapted from production of 2S5 and 2A36 barrels, because
yeah,
that's the system 2S22 is based on.
yeah. But I know there's speculation for some time that they were refurbishing barrels, but no, that it is adaptation of tooling and new manufacture is
You know,
really quite
there could
interesting.
also be remanufacturing of leftover 2A36 barrels or 2S5 barrels, for example,
Yeah,
as munition for the OSINT family is in pretty short supply in Ukraine.
yeah,
Because really only Russia still makes it.
yeah. But I believe there was a photo as of recent of one of the Bodana artillery pieces in testing. That was also the same photo set that had the it was the
It
T80
was the
UD.
T80 with the T64 running gear,
Yes, but
which
that was
was
the
being used for tank barrel evaluation and proofing.
yeah.
So
But that was
they're
interesting as well. That they are actually producing, or at least testing new tank barrels as well. So that there is any sort of barrel production in Ukraine is very impressive.
and even more impressive considering the numbers we're talking about, especially for a country where you would think that any sort of large static military industry would be a primary target for cruise missiles.
Yes. Yes. Now,
Now,
whether that is also some barrels that are produced out of the country that may have been getting, final certification in country as well, that's a definite possibility. But
there is the real possibility, and some interviews of people that worked on the 2S22 have suggested that at least some of the manufacturing for the systems is happening out of country.
yeah,
Now,
more than
that could
likely with the
potentially
Czechs.
be referring to them importing the truck chassis,
Yeah.
or that could be referring to more actual substantial parts manufacturing happening and those then being imported into the country for assembly.
Yeah.
Or even some assembly work happening outside of the country. Those are all possibilities.
Yeah.
Now, another interesting thing to note was that a new variant of the 2S22 showed up.
Yes.
I
And I
have
forget what was the truck chassis being used for that.
Those were Tetra 815-7s, or Tetra 4s, as they're being commercially called. Hence why I had decided to call it the Mod 3.2, because it's still based on the Tetra chassis, which is the Mod 3 family, and it's the 0.2 iteration of the system, now with a domestically produced cap. So the assumption is that these are newly produced chassis imported from Tetra, rather than using the chassis with the Puma cab from the
Yeah.
modernized BM27s that Ukraine had,
Yeah.
which ran out of ammunition practically instantly on the war starting and were then reused as basis for the Mod 3 2S22s.
Yeah. But no, the 36 systems a month is really staggering. And I believe it was yesterday we had some of the first footage of one of them with a broken power rammer on board it, and the crew was manually ramming it. So the systems they're getting used, and stuff is
The
breaking on them as used systems would.
the shell
So
rammers have been the most controversial part of the 2S22 because, according to crew testimonies at least, they have found that they are rather unreliable, and they also have a rather wide swinging arc outside of the vehicle, which means you have to dig larger firing positions for them, which is why they're not often used.
yeah,
So when you see a 2S22 outside of training, especially, they are more than likely being loaded manually.
yeah. It'll be interesting to see if they do a design revision at some point of that.
They might do a design revision on the shell rammer itself, mainly because the one they're using now is practically a part for part copy of the one on the 2S5.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it has been a very successful program. Probably the most successful program we've seen of the of Ukrainian domestic defense materials.
I'd say it's the second most successful program behind all the drone production.
Absolutely, I was just going to say that. Yeah, referring to vehicles, I
Because
guess.
referring to vehicles, it's likely the most successful program Ukraine's currently running,
Yeah,
only being outdone by the drone program on just sheer volume.
yeah,
Because according to Ukraine, last year alone, they produced somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.3 million drones of all
yeah.
types combined, which was absolutely ludicrous.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Also, currently there is a push going on within Ukrainian politics to lift the ban on weapons exports,
Which that has the potential to
to
lead to a lot of
bring the
interesting things.
2S22 into the open market, where it could be a real competitor against systems like Caesar, and especially the
Absolutely,
Chinese SH-15, just because
absolutely.
of its price, because depending on the chassis, the 2S22 is either $2.5 or $2.8 million a piece,
Yeah.
which is very cheap
Yes.
for a 155 system, considering that Caesar Mark 1, so the 6x6 variant that France is currently producing, comes in at between 5 and 6 million.
Yeah. And also considering the production rate.
Yeah, especially the production rate.
Yeah. Which is practically unmatched. I mean,
Yeah,
36 system months. Yeah. That's basically unmatched for any vehicle borne artillery piece.
I know. With that, I think we can move on to our second artillery topic, and that was Turgis Gyar. Sorry for my French.
Yep.
Announcing that they have a proposal for France's MLRS replacement program. So France is in the market to replace its decrepit fleet of M270 LRUs, of which it only has, I think, 6 left, with a new quote-unquote domestic system. Now, they have asked a couple of companies to make proposals, but they're also looking at what is potentially available off the shelf. Turgis Gyar has now proposed a system which is pretty much just an M142 but French,
Yes.
where
With some controversy.
where the manufacturer claims that the system is compatible with the American MFOM pod system used on M142 and M270, but Lockheed denies this. And they have denied this to our good friend Colby when he did a information request to them. So
Yeah,
It will be
Yeah.
interesting to note what comes of this.
The issue I really had was the statement Colby got from Lockheed didn't really offer any specifics as to saying why it wouldn't be compatible. And I'm assuming it would be, firmware or something like that, where
It
it,
would be data interface and software, which would be the main hurdles.
yeah. But even then, I don't see why the French could not, just produce something that matches the physical dimensions that could, in theory, use, non-Lockheed MFOM if there was interest in producing that. Which I mean that is something. If you could say that this is dimensionally accurate, and this can use MFOM, and if we buy these systems and we go to Lockheed and we try to ask really nicely for domestic licensing in the munitions.
Ask really nicely with a big briefcase of money.
Yes, but I mean the question there also is this seemed ridiculous until the announcement this week with Rheinmetall and Lockheed.
Yeah, where Rheinmetall would be producing, is looking to produce in Germany 10,000 MLRS missiles a year and 10,000 training missiles a year.
Yeah. So I mean, if there is German production of Lockheed systems on the continent,
then stepping away from MFOM, even with the US being the US right now,
yeah,
doesn't really make a lot of sense because Trump is temporary.
yes.
He should be
Now,
out after this term.
yeah,
But defense
yeah, I mean
procurement is for 20, 30, 40 years.
yeah, which that has always been my criticism of trying to move away from MFOM. Just aside from the fact that it's a good system, the idea of a 6-round containerized system that can sit in storage for decades, that's
And you
environmentally
can then
sealed, that's easy to
quickly load
reload.
into your system when you need it.
Yes,
Keep firing dozens of missiles an hour.
yes. I mean, it's a good system fundamentally.
Fundamentally,
And
there's really no complaints about how MFOM works, how it integrates into M240 and M142. The only complaints ever coming from it are US export restrictions.
yeah, but even then, the thing that kind of puzzles me about aside from the issues with with Lockheed saying it's not compatible and presumptions that it's software related. I mean, we have seen other countries reverse engineer the MLRS system.
I think the greatest example here would be Israel with Poles and South Korea with K239.
Yeah, and one of the Turkish companies at one point was marketing reverse engineered munitions that were MFOM compatible.
Yeah, but that's
So I
Turkey. They
mean,
just do everything illegally.
yeah, and I mean there is perhaps aside from the fact that the French could officially try to work out some deal with Lockheed to for local production to ensure compatibility, or buy the subsystems even for this French HIMARS.
Now,
Um, yeah,
this is where we get to another problem with the program itself, which is that France wants working systems by, I think, 2027. At
and
which
what
point, a
was
lot
the
of people have complained that Lockheed has too big of an order backlog to fulfill the, honestly, microscopic demand France has, because they want 6 systems
yes,
before the end of the decade. 6.
yes, yeah, it was a very small amount.
I'm honestly convinced that Lockheed could just shuffle off 5 guys into a shed and have them produce 6 by the end of the decade,
Yeah, they certainly could.
while the main production line continues running for the 500 Poland ones.
Yeah, yeah, this entire French announcement was very strange. um, in my opinion, it's the best. I mean, it's the most. It's simple. Other than the issue of figuring out the compatibility or figure out exactly what needs to be compatible for it to work with other MFOM munitions. Which, if it is software, it's not like workarounds couldn't be figured out for that. Lockheed would not be happy, but that could be
Lockheed
done.
would be very unhappy.
Yeah,
But that's Lockheed.
yeah,
And I do think that if you throw enough money at them, they would be willing to do the integration just so they can keep selling you the missiles.
yeah, exactly.
Because that's market they don't want to lose.
Yeah,
Because if they are going to go through all this trouble of setting up production in Germany, then they do actually want to have customers on the continent.
exactly. And I mean, it would make sense even at that point for the French to try to potentially get involved in the joint production relationship between Rheinmetall and Lockheed. Which that may be kind of a tall order, getting actual,
No, at that point you're also involving MBDA.
Yeah.
So that could needlessly
like,
complicate the matter, but yeah, it's not like France needs millions of missiles. They only want 6 systems.
No. But it's also not like MBDA wouldn't want to make a missile that would be MFOM compatible.
Or just have a small RHM facility that does it in France.
Yeah, that too.
That is final assembly in France of parts that are produced in Germany at the big facility.
Yeah. Yeah, it will be very interesting to see what happens with that, if anything even happens with that, and who knows? The French may decide they just want to do a very deep upgrade and hour zero overhaul of the M270s. Who knows?
Or they buy Pinaka. Who knows?
Hey, that's. But moving on to the next subject, that might have been more possible prior to the events of last week.
Yeah,
the buying Pinaka. So we'll see.
Now we're not really going to into what's going on between India and Pakistan. I think everyone knows that the two are shooting at each other right now.
Yes,
but we are now going to talk about something that happened just before that, and it is France and India signing France's biggest defense export deal of all time, valued at $7.5 billion US dollars.
Yes.
The deal includes 26 Rafale Marine variants for India's aircraft carrier, where they are not going to be replacing the MiG-29K, but supplementing it until a full fleet replacement is found. Which was honestly surprising, because most people had thought they would just go full in on Rafale and completely phase out the MiG. Additionally, the deal includes upgrades to India's now 35 Rafale fleet, spare parts, and I thought also munitions of some sorts.
Yeah. Well, specifically with the naval idea and the fact that it was to fill a gap until a full fleet replacement could be found. A lot of the scale of the Rafale contract, at least in my opinion, has to do with the relative failure of the Tejas aircraft. And the fact that the Indians, I believe, were hoping to seek a navalized variant of that. I think that really was intended as the primary MiG-29, carrier-borne aircraft. But with that failure, I mean, they really didn't have any other choice. So
now it's still surprising to me that they just didn't outright go for a full Rafale fleet. But it's also understandable, seeing as that they do have a domestic program running to develop a successor to Tejas.
Yeah.
which could replace both the Su-30 MKI on land and the MiG-29K, and then also the Rafale at sea.
Yeah. But the
Now,
other thing to consider about the MiG-29 being kept in service and them not fully replacing is the Indians do have domestic, uh, you know,
servicing
they're able to,
capabilities.
yeah, they have domestic capabilities for these aircraft, and if they're not, completely
Falling apart.
wore out to the point of getting rid of them, why get rid of them if they're hours are not that if they're not that high in hours and they're in reasonably good shape. I mean, that does sort of make sense to keep them in service, but it's unfortunate that there's a lot of complex decision making that goes on with Indian defense programs, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
But with the naval idea, that's maybe a little clearer, in my opinion. With land based, that's its own complicated thing as
Yeah,
well.
India's land-based aircraft inventory is ranging from the hyper-modern to the archaic,
Yes,
because they do still fly MiG-21s.
yes. Which I think they have been really hoping to phase out of service. And again, I think that was one of those things that the Tejas
Meant to
was meant
do before the
to replace.
program just fell apart.
Yes. Now, even though it fell apart, it is not fully dead. It's still seemingly alive, but
It's not fully
I
dead. I don't know if India actually produced any of the Tejas and has them in service. I need to look more into India's inventory
yeah,
of equipment.
yeah,
But they are working on a Tejas successor,
yeah,
which would then become the general replacement for the legacy Soviet platforms.
yeah.
But again,
But I mean, no,
that's 10, 20 years in the future.
yeah, but yeah, I mean, with the Rafael contract, and I believe was that the MRCI program? Was that what the initial competition that Rafael won was that what it was referred to as?
I don't remember.
Okay, I want to say it was something like that, but that had been a long running competition, and I think it had Rafael, it had the Gripen. I think two separate F-16 proposals were submitted to that at one point. So I mean, it was a major contract, initially, and Rafael ultimately won. And I think the fact that it was not dependent on foreign parts support and stuff, or it was not dependent on, as a Twitter commentator likes to say, Rafael is an ITAR free aircraft, which India is familiar with being sanctioned and parts support getting cut off. That happened after the nuclear tests they ran. So I mean, that was
Now,
probably a
it's
major.
it's still unknown if France is also not going to cut off part supply if India just decides to nuke Pakistan.
That too, and I mean as of you said you didn't want to get into the subject of
I don't want
the
to get into the
Indo-Pakistan skirmish.
subject, mainly because I know too little about it.
Yes, but the Rafael definitely made a lot of news in that, and
Which, from everything that's being talked about, is more on Indian mission planning than anything with the plane
absolutely,
itself.
absolutely. Um, and as to whether that even colors, the contracts going forward, I doubt it will. Partially because the Indians don't really have much of a choice. When you consider their land-based aircraft that this is meant to supplant, like you said, MiG-21. The Indian MiG-21s I believe, were meant to be out of service 5 or 6 years ago, and
Yeah.
they've had to keep them in service. There's no
And
choice.
they are still regularly having accidents with them. I think last year one crashed.
Yeah, and Correct me if I'm wrong, but does the Indian Air Force operate the MiG-29 at all, or is it strictly the Navy?
I think it's strictly the Navy. The Air Force operates the Su-30.
Yeah. But even from the standpoint of just fighters, I mean, seemingly the Su-30, the Indians pushed that into a strike role as well, carrying the BrahMos missiles and such. So I mean, the need for a modern fighter is definitely there, and it has been a huge win for the French. Being their largest defense contract. So
Just to come just quickly back to the Su-30, it is surprisingly how much platform autonomy India has on that plane if you look at its
yes,
actual weapons integration list.
yes, absolutely.
Because, it has the standard suite of Soviet and Russian weaponry, but then there's also stuff like French air-to-air missiles and the BrahMos cruise missile.
And I believe the Python 5 air to I believe they have Israeli air to air missiles
Yeah.
for them. Yeah, I mean the
So
the
India
Su-30.
has deep control over those planes in terms
Yes,
of what they can do to them, what integration work they can do, what foreign
yeah,
contractors they can get to come and do the integration work.
yeah,
Because at that point, you're
yeah.
looking
I
at
mean the
NBDA, you're looking at
Elbit systems. Yeah,
Elbit. I forgot if it was Elbit or Raphael that did it,
I
but it
think it
was
was Elbit.
Elbit.
Yeah. No, I mean the Su-30 MKI was really an impressive program. They got a very impressive aircraft, and it was surprising how well that went from the standpoint of integration, and there really wasn't much. The Indians really didn't have any issues with the Russians and stuff in terms of
The Russians
open
just
systems
wanted to get a
architecture.
sale, so they were very accommodating.
Yes, yes, and the Indians did get a very good aircraft.
And not an
Um,
inconsequential amount of them as well.
no, no, it really wasn't. But
Especially
from the look,
if you looked back at India's economic capability of the time they were producing these.
yeah,
Because India has massively changed economy wise over the last 20 years.
it definitely has.
To the point where it can now sign 7.5 billion USD defense procurement deals.
Yeah. Now with the munitions contract with Rafael, or with the French purchasing, or with the French contract, with the munitions that the Indians had bought, were there any details about what those were and when those deliveries began?
No, that was just general spare parts, munitions,
Okay,
technical support as well. Just tag it on to the end of the contract announcement.
gotcha. Yeah, because I know
If they are
during.
procuring any specific naval weapons, I don't know, because as far as I know, they want to press BrahMos into the service of an anti-ship missile as well.
Yeah,
So I don't really see them procuring Exocet, for example.
yeah. Because I didn't know if that was part of this contract or if that was a previous
That
contract.
was previous contract because
Okay.
those are being used right now.
Yeah, yeah. We had scalp debris spotted, and all that, so I didn't know how recent those deliveries may have been. And was the AASM or Hammer or whatever it's referred to internationally,
I
was that a recent delivery as well or no?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'd have to look into it. I can't say if they were recent or not. We
Yeah.
do know that France is outproducing its pledge of 50 bombs per month to Ukraine.
Yeah.
So those could have been recent deliveries, but they could have also been delivered before.
Yeah, I feel like that was a previous contract they had with India. The the AASMs. So I'm not entirely sure, but I don't think it was real recent. But yeah, I mean it was a major contract, and the Indians honestly they they picked pretty well, and they didn't really have much choice. They needed to replace
No,
certain legacy
it
aircraft.
was going to be Rafale Marine or FA-18.
Yeah.
So I believe they made the better choice out of the two aircrafts being offered.
Compared to F-18, yes. Certainly. Just with the issues facing keeping the F-18 production lines open and such. It would not have been great if India was kind of one of the last customers for that, for new build aircraft. I mean, so yeah, Rafale was probably the good choice.
I know. With that, I do want to thank you for hopping on here with me, especially at
Yep.
such relatively short notice.
Yep, no problem.
And I'd like to thank all of you for listening, and we will be seeing you all again next time.